Hello movie makers! Today I'm going to talk about depth of field. And depth of field refers to how many planes of focus you have within your shot. You can have shallow focus or deep focus and everything in between. With shallow focus, one subject is crisp and everything in the foreground and everything in the background is going to be incrementally out of focus. With deep focus, everything from the foreground to the background remains crisp. This is a famous example of deep focus from Citizen Kane, where we have Charles Foster Kane's mother in the foreground in focus, and then everything remains in focus all the way to the background, where we see the young Kane playing outside the window. There are three factors that influence depth of field, and those three things are f-stop, focal length, and focus setting. In terms of f-stop, the more closed down you are, the more depth of field you're going to have. So at f11, you have more depth of field than at f4, which has more depth of field than f2. So in bright light situations, you have deep focus, and in low light situations, you have shallow focus. For instance, if you're shooting outside and you have an f16 or an f11, you are by definition going to have deep focus. Now look at this shot from Martin Scorsese's After Hours, where they're shooting in very low light conditions with the lens all the way opened up, so they have very shallow depth of field. So as this cab pulls away, it just gets more and more and more out of focus. The focal length of the lens you choose will also have an effect on depth of field. Wide-angle lenses have more depth of field than telephoto lenses. So a 10mm lens has more depth of field than a 25mm lens, which has more depth of field than a 75mm lens. Here's another deep focus shot from Citizen Kane, where everything from the foreground to the background is in focus. This is achieved by using a wide-angle lens. However, if you want the subject to be in focus, but things in the foreground and things in the background to be less sharp, you need to use a telephoto lens. The third thing that determines depth of field is your focus setting. The further away the subject is that you're focusing to, the more depth of field you're going to have. So if your focus setting is at infinity, you have more depth of field than if you're focused at 10 feet, and at 10 feet you have more depth of field than if your focus is set at 2 feet. So with close-ups, you generally have shallow focus. Take for instance this close-up, where the focus was set at 3 feet. Now we set the focus with the actress sitting straight up, but there was so little depth of field that when she leaned forward, she went slightly soft. Alright, so when does depth of field come into play? Let's say you have a shot with a character in the foreground and a character in the background talking to each other, and you want them both to be in focus simultaneously, rather than racking back and forth between whichever character is talking. You'll need lots of depth of field. This shot from Citizen Kane, they used a wide-angle lens, a far focus setting, and a high f-stop. If you want to do a rack focus, you'll want shallow depth of field, so you can easily shift primary focus from one plane to another. With this shot, we wanted to do a rack focus from me in the foreground to the actor in the background, but it was very difficult because we were shooting under bright sunlight, which was giving us a high f-stop and creating a lot of depth of field. So we shot with a telephoto lens, placed me very close to the camera, and used an 85 N6 filter, which changed our f-stop from f16 to f8, knocking down our depth of field. But even then, the rack barely registers. If you're shooting on the fly and you don't have a lot of time to keep measuring for focus, you can shoot with a wide-angle lens, which gives you greater depth of field and greater latitude in terms of focus. Robert Rodriguez shot a lot of El Mariachi using a wide-angle lens, and he didn't have to stop and refocus because the depth of field was so great. By manipulating your f-stop, your lens choice, and your focus setting, you determine what in your shot is in focus and what is out of focus.